Chapter 15 Zeno the Stoic. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Ancient and Modern Celebrated Freethinkers by Charles Bradlaugh. Chapter 15 Zeno the Stoic. In the previous number we gave a short sketch of the opinions of Epicurus. In this we shall deal with the founder of a rival sect, the Stoics. Amongst the disciples and students in the Stoic schools have been many illustrious names, and not the least worthy is the name with which we are now dealing. Zeno was born at Citius, a small maritime town in the island of Cyprus. This place having been originally peopled by a colony of Phoenicians, Zeno is sometimes called a Phoenician, but at the period when he flourished it was chiefly inhabited by Greeks. The date of his birth is uncertain, but must have been about the year B.C. 362. His father was a merchant, and Zeno appears to have been, in the early part of his life, engaged in mercantile pursuits. He received a very liberal education from his father, whom we are told perceived in his son a strong inclination for philosophical studies, and who purchased for Zeno the writings of the Socratic philosophers, which were studied with avidity, and which undoubtedly exercised a considerable influence over his future thinkings. When about 30 years of age, he made a trading voyage from Citius to Athens, with a very valuable cargo of Phoenician purple, but was unfortunately shipwrecked on the coast of Greece, and the whole of his freight destroyed. It is supposed that this severe loss, which must have considerably reduced his means, materially influenced Zeno, and induced him to embrace the tenets of the Cynics, whose leading principle was a contempt of riches. We are told that upon his first arrival in Athens, he went into the shop of a bookseller, and took up, by accident, a volume of the Commentaries of Xenophon. After reading a few pages, Zeno was so much delighted with the work, that he asked the bookseller to direct him where he might meet such men as the author. Crates, the Cynic philosopher, passed by at the time, and the bookseller said, "Follow that man." He did so, and after listening to several of his discourses, was so pleased with the doctrines of the Cynics, that he became a disciple. He did not long remain attached to the Cynic school. Their peculiar manners were too gross for him, and his energetic and inquiring mind was too much cramped by that indifference to all scientific investigation which was one of their leading characteristics. He therefore sought instruction elsewhere, and Stilpo of Megara became his teacher, from whom he acquired the art of disputation, in which he afterwards became so proficient. The Cynics were displeased at his following other philosophy, and we are told that Crates attempted to drag him by force out of the school of Stilpo, on which Zeno said, "You may seize my body, but Stilpo has laid hold of my mind." The Megaric doctrine was, however, insufficient. Zeno was willing to learn all that Stilpo could teach, but having learned all, his restless and insatiable appetite for knowledge required more, and after an attendance of several years upon the lectures of Stilpo, he passed over to the expositors of Plato, Xenocrates, and Polemo. The latter philosopher appears to have penetrated Zeno's design in attending the various schools, i.e., to collect materials from various quarters for a new system of his own, and when he came to the school, Polemo said, "I am no stranger, Zeno, to your Phoenician arts. I perceive that your design is to creep slyly into my garden and steal away my fruit." After 20 years of studying, having mastered the tenets of various schools, Zeno determined to become the founder of a sect himself. In accordance with this determination, he opened a school in a public portico, called the Painted Porch, from the pictures of Polygnotus, and other eminent painters, with which it was adorned. This portico became famous in Athens, and was called Stoa, the Porch. From this Stoa the school derived its name, the students being called the Stoics. Zeno was a subtle reasoner, and exceedingly popular. He taught a strict system of morals, and exhibited a pleasing picture of moral discipline in his own life. As a man, his character appears deserving of the highest respect. He became exceedingly respected and revered at Athens for the probity and severity of his life and manners, and consistency thereof with his doctrine. He possessed so large a share of public esteem, that the Athenians decreed him a golden crown, and on account of his approved integrity, deposited the keys of their citadel in his hands. Antiguus Gonates, king of Macedon, was a constant attendant at his lectures whilst at Athens, and when that monarch returned, he earnestly invited Zeno to his court. During the philosopher's lifetime, the Athenians erected a statue of brass as a mark of the estimation in which they held him. Zeno lived to the extreme age of 98, when, as he was leaving his school one day, he fell and broke his finger. The consciousness of his infirmity afflicted him so much, that he exclaimed, "Why am I thus importuned? Earth, I obey thy summons," and immediately going home, he put his affairs in order, and strangled himself. In person, Zeno was tall and slender, his brow was furrowed with thought, and this, with his long and close application to study, gave a tinge of severity to his aspect. Although of a feeble constitution, he preserved his health by his great abstemiousness, his diet consisting of figs, breads, and honey. He was plain and modest in his dress and habits, and very frugal in all his expenses, showing the same respect for the poor as for the rich, and conversing as freely with the slave as he did with the king. Independent in spirit, he broke off all communication with his friend Demochares, because that person had offered to procure a gratuity for Zeno from the king of Macedon. His system appears to have been little more than a collection from his various lessons of whatever was most in unison with his peculiar habit of thought, and an attempt to reconcile and combine in one system the various elements of different theories. Taking from so many schools various portions of their doctrine, he seems to have provoked the antagonism of many of his contemporaries, and several philosophers of learning and ability employed their eloquence to diminish the growing influence of the new school. Towards the close of his life, he found a powerful antagonist in the person of Epicurus, and the Epicureans and Stoics have since treated each other as rival sects. Zeno's school appears to have been generally a resort for the poor, and it was a common joke amongst his adversaries that poverty was the charm for which he was indebted for his scholars. The list of his disciples, however, contains the names of some very rich and powerful men, who may have regarded the Stoic theory as a powerful counter agent to the growing effeminacy of the age. After Zeno's death, the Athenians, at the request of Antigonus, erected a monument to his memory in Ceramicura. From the particulars which have been related concerning Zeno, it will not be difficult to perceive what kind of influence his circumstances and character must have had upon his philosophical system. If his doctrines be diligently compared with the history of his life, it will appear, that having attended upon many eminent preceptors, and being intimately conversant with their opinions, he compiled, out of their various tenets, an heterogeneous system, on the credit of which he assumed to himself the title of the founder of a new sect. The dialectic arts which Zeno learned in the school of Diodorus Cronus, he did not fail to apply to the support of his own system, and to communicate to his followers. As to the moral doctrine of the Cynic sect, to which Zeno strictly adhered to the last, there can be no doubt that he transferred it almost without alloy into his own school. In morals, the principal difference between the Cynics and the Stoics was that the former disdained the cultivation of nature, the latter affected to rise above it. On the subject of physics, Zeno received his doctrine through the channel of the Platonic school, as will fully appear from a careful comparison of their respective systems. The Stoic philosophy being in this manner of heterogeneous origin, it necessarily partook of the several systems of which it was composed. The idle quibbles, jejune reasoning, and imposing sophisms, which so justly exposed the schools of the dialectic philosophers to ridicule, found their way into the porch, where much time was wasted and much ingenuity thrown away upon questions of no importance. Cicero censures the Stoics for encouraging in their schools a barren kind of disputation, and employing themselves in determining trifling questions, in which the disputants can have no interest, and which at the close leave them neither wiser nor better; and that this censure is not, as some modern advocates for Stoicism have maintained, a mere calumny, but grounded upon fact, sufficiently appears from what is said by the ancients, particularly by Sextus Empiricus, concerning the logic of the Stoics. Seneca, who was himself a Stoic, candidly acknowledges this. It may, perhaps, be thought surprising that philosophers who affected so much gravity and wisdom should condescend to such trifling occupations. But it must be considered that, at this time, a fondness for subtle disputations so generally prevailed in Greece, that excellence in the arts of reasoning and sophistry was a sure path to fame. The Stoics, with whom vanity was unquestionably a ruling passion, were ambitious for this kind of reputation. Hence it was that they engaged with so much vehemence in verbal contests, and that they largely contributed towards the confusion, instead of the improvement of science, by substituting vague and ill-defined terms in the room of accurate conceptions. The moral part of the Stoic philosophy, in like manner, partook of the defects of its origin. It may be as justly objected against the Stoics as the Cynics, that they assumed an artificial severity of manners, and a tone of virtue above the condition of a man. Their doctrine of moral wisdom was an ostentatious display of words, in which little regard was paid to nature and reason. It professed to raise human nature to a degree of perfection before unknown, but its real effect was merely to amuse the ear and captivate the fancy with fictions which can never be realized. The extravagancies and absurdities of the Stoical philosophy may also be in some measure ascribed to the vehement contests which subsisted between Zeno and the Academics on the one hand, and between him and Epicurus on the other. For not only did these disputes give rise to many of the dogmas of Stoicism, but led Zeno and his followers, in the warmth of controversy, to drive their arguments to the utmost extremity, and to express themselves with much greater confidence than they would probably otherwise have done. This is perhaps the true reason why so many extravagant notions are ascribed to the Stoics, particularly upon the subject of morals. Whilst Epicurus taught his followers to seek happiness in tranquillity, Zeno imagined his wise man not only free from all sense of pleasure, but void of all passions and emotions, and capable of being happy in the midst of torture. That he might avoid the position taken by the Epicureans, he had recourse to a moral institution, which bore indeed the lofty front of wisdom, but which was elevated far above the condition and powers of human nature. The natural disposition of Zeno and his manner of life had, moreover, no inconsiderable influence in fixing the peculiar character of his philosophy. By nature severe and morose, and constitutionally inclined to reserve and melancholy, he early cherished this habit by submitting to the austere and rigid discipline of the Cynics. Those qualities which he conceived to be meritorious in himself, and which he found to conciliate the admiration of mankind, he naturally transferred to his imaginary character of a wise or perfect man. In order to form an accurate judgment concerning the doctrine of the Stoics, besides a careful attention to the particulars already enumerated, it will be necessary to guard with the utmost caution against two errors, into which several writers have fallen. Great care should be taken, in the first place, not to judge of the doctrine of the Stoics from words and sentiments, detached from the general system, but to consider them as they stand, related to the whole train of premises and conclusions. The second caution is, not to confound the genuine doctrines of Zeno and other ancient fathers of this sect with the glosses of the later Stoics. Out of the many proofs of this change which might be adduced, we shall select one, which is the more worthy of notice, as it has occasioned many disputes among the learned. The doctrine we mean is that concerning fate. This doctrine, according to Zeno and Chrysippus, implies an eternal and immutable series of causes and effects, within which all events are included, and to which the Deity himself is subject; whereas the later Stoics, changing the term fate into the providence of God, discoursed with great plausibility on this subject, but still in reality retained the ancient doctrine of universal fate. From this example, a judgment may be formed concerning the necessity of using some caution, in appealing to the writings of Seneca, Antoninus, and Epictetus, as authorities in determining what were the original doctrines of the Stoic philosophers. Concerning philosophy in general, the doctrine of the Stoics was, that wisdom consists in the knowledge of things divine and human; that philosophy is such an exercise of the mind as produces wisdom; that in this exercise consists the nature of virtue; and consequently that virtue is a term of extensive meaning, comprehending the right employment of the mind in reasoning, in the study of nature, and in morals. The wisdom of the Stoics is either progressive through several stages, or perfect, when every weakness is subdued and every error corrected, without the possibility of a relapse into folly or vice, or of being again enslaved by any passion, or afflicted by any calamity. With Socrates and the Cynics, Zeno represented virtue as the only true wisdom. But being disposed to extend the pursuits of his wise man into the regions of speculation and science, he gave, after his usual manner, a new signification to an old term, and comprehended the exercise of the understanding in the search of truth, as well as the government of the appetites and passions, under the general term virtue. The great importance of the united exercise of the intellectual and active powers of the mind are thus beautifully asserted by the philosophical emperor: "Let every one endeavor so to think and act, that his contemplative and active faculties may at the same time be going on towards perfection. His clear conceptions and certain knowledge will then produce within him an entire confidence in himself, unperceived perhaps by others, though not affectedly concealed, which will give a simplicity and dignity to his character, for he will at all times be able to judge, concerning the several objects which come before him, what is their real nature, what place they hold in the universe, how long they are by nature fitted to last, of what materials they are composed, by whom they may be possessed, and who is able to bestow them or take them away." The sum of the definitions and rules given by the Stoics concerning logic is this: logic is either rhetorical or dialectic. Rhetorical logic is the art of reasoning and discoursing on those subjects which require a diffuse kind of declamation. Dialectic is the art of close argumentation in the form of disputation or dialogue. The former resembles an open, the latter a closed hand. Rhetoric is of three kinds: deliberative, judicial, and demonstrative. The dialectic art is the instrument of knowledge, as it enables a man to distinguish truth from error, and certainty from bare probability. This art considers things as expressed by words, and words themselves. External things are perceived by a certain impression, made either upon some parts of the brain or upon the percipient faculty, which may be called an image, since it is impressed upon the mind like the image of a seal upon wax. This image is commonly accompanied with a belief of the reality of the thing perceived, but not necessarily, since it does not accompany every image, but those only which are not attended with any evidence of deception. Where only the image is perceived by itself, the thing is apprehensible. Where it is acknowledged and approved as the image of some real thing, the impression is called apprehension, because the object is apprehended by the mind as a body is grasped by the hand. Such apprehension, if it will bear the examination of reason, is knowledge. If it is not examined, it is mere opinion. If it will not bear this examination, it is misapprehension. The senses, corrected by reason, give a faithful report, not by affording a perfect apprehension of the entire nature of things, but by leaving no room to doubt of their reality. Nature has furnished us with these apprehensions as the elements of knowledge, whence further conceptions are raised in the mind, and a way is opened for the investigations of reason. Some images are sensible, or received immediately through the senses; others rational, which are perceived only in the mind. These latter are called notions or ideas. Some images are probable, to which the mind assents without hesitation; others improbable, to which it does not readily assent; and others doubtful, where it is not entirely perceived whether they are true or false. True images are those which arise from things really existing, and agree with them. False images, or phantasms, are immediately derived from no real object. Images are apprehended by immediate perception through the senses, as when we see a man; consequentially by likeness, as when from a portrait we apprehend the original; by composition, as when, by compounding a horse and man, we acquire the image of a centaur; by augmentation, as in the image of a cyclops; or by diminution, as in that of a pygmy. Judgment is employed either in determining concerning particular things, or concerning general propositions. In judging of things we make use of some one of our senses, as a common criterion or measure of apprehension, by which we judge whether a thing is or is not, whether or not it exists with certain properties; or we apply to the thing concerning which a judgment is to be formed some artificial measure, as a balance, a rule, etc., or we call in other peculiar measures to determine things not perceptible by the senses. In judging of general propositions, we make use of our preconceptions, or universal principles, as criteria or measures of judgment. The first impressions from the senses produce in the mind an involuntary emotion, but a wise man afterwards deliberately examines them, that he may know whether they be true or false, and assents to or rejects them, as the evidence which offers itself to his understanding appears sufficient or insufficient. This assent or approbation will indeed be as necessarily given or withheld according to the ultimate state of the proofs which are adduced, as the scales of a balance will sink or rise according to the weights which are placed upon them. But while the vulgar give immediate credit to the reports of the senses, wise men suspend their assent till they have deliberately examined the nature of things, and carefully estimated the weight of evidence. The mind of man is originally like a blank leaf, wholly without characters, but capable of receiving any. The impressions which are made upon it by means of the senses remain in the memory after the objects which occasioned them are removed. A succession of these continued impressions, made by similar objects, produces experience, and hence arises permanent notions, opinions, and knowledge. Even universal principles are originally formed by experience from sensible images. All men agree in their common notions or preconceptions. Disputes only arise concerning the application of these to particular cases. Let us pass on to the Stoical doctrine concerning nature. According to Zeno and his followers, there existed from eternity a dark and confused chaos, in which was contained the first principles of all future beings. This chaos being at length arranged, and emerging into variable forms, became the world as it now subsists. The world, or nature, is that whole which comprehends all things, and of which all things are parts and members. The universe, though one whole, contains two principles, distinct from elements, one passive, the other active. The passive principle is pure matter without qualities. The active principle is reason, or God. This is the fundamental doctrine of the Stoics concerning nature. The Stoical system teaches that both the active and passive principles in nature are corporeal, since whatever acts or suffers must be so. The efficient cause, or God, is pure ether, or fire, inhabiting the exterior surface of the heavens, where every thing which is divine is placed. This ethereal substance of divine fire comprehends all the vital principles by which individual beings are necessarily produced, and contains the forms of things which from the highest regions of the universe are diffused through every other part of nature. Seneca, indeed, calls God incorporeal reason, but by this term he can only mean to distinguish the divine ethereal substance from gross bodies; for, according to the Stoics, whatever has a substantial existence is corporeal. Nothing is incorporeal, except that infinite vacuum which surrounds the universe. Even mind and voice are corporeal, and in like manner deity. Matter, or the passive principle, in the Stoical system, is destitute of all qualities, but ready to receive any form, inactive and without motion, unless moved by some external cause. The contrary principle, or the ethereal operative fire, being active, and capable of producing all things from matter, with consummate skill, according to the forms which it contains, although in its nature corporeal, considered in opposition to gross and sluggish matter, or to the elements, is said to be immaterial and spiritual. For want of carefully attending to the preceding distinction, some writers have been so far imposed upon by the bold innovations of the Stoics in the use of terms, as to inter from the appellations which they sometimes apply to the Deity, that they conceived him to be strictly and properly incorporeal. The truth appears to be, that as they sometimes spoke of the soul of man, a portion of the divinity, as an exceedingly rare and subtle body, and sometimes as a warm or fiery spirit, so they spoke of the Deity as corporeal, considered as distinct from the incorporeal vacuum, or infinite space, but as spiritual, considered in opposition to gross and inactive matter. They taught, indeed, that God is underived, incorruptible, and eternal, possessed of intelligence, good and perfect, the efficient cause of all the peculiar qualities or forms of things, and the constant preserver and governor of the world. And they described the Deity under many noble images, and in the most elevated language. The hymn of Clinthus, in particular, is justly admired for the grandeur of its sentiments, and the sublimity of its diction. But if in reading these descriptions we hastily associate with them modern conceptions of Deity, and neglect to recur to the leading principles of the sect, we shall be led into fundamental misapprehensions of the true doctrine of Stoicism. For according to this sect, God and matter are alike underived and eternal, and God is the former of the universe in no other sense than as he has been the necessary, efficient cause, by which motion and form have been impressed upon matter. What notions the Stoics entertained of God sufficiently appears from the single opinion of his finite nature, an opinion which necessarily followed from the motion that he is only a part of a spherical, and therefore a finite universe. On the doctrine of divine providence, which was one of the chief points upon which the Stoics disputed with the Epicureans, much is written, and with great strength and elegance, by Seneca, Epictetus, and later Stoics, but we are not to judge of the genuine and original doctrine of this sect from the discourses of writers who had probably corrupted their language on this subject by visiting the Christian school. The only way to form an accurate judgment of their opinions concerning Providence is to compare their popular language upon this head with their general system, and explaining the former consistently with the fundamental principles of the latter. If this be fairly done, it will appear that the agency of Deity is, according to the Stoics, nothing more than the active motion of a celestial ether, or fire, possessed of intelligence, which at first gave form to the shapeless mass of gross matter, and being always essentially united to the visible world by the same necessary agency, preserves its order and harmony. The Stoic idea of Providence is, not that of a being, wholly independent of matter, freely directing and governing all things, but that of a necessary chain of causes and effects, arising from the action of a power which is itself a part of the existence which it regulates, and which, equally with that existence, is subject to the immutable law of necessity. Providence, in the Stoic creed, is only another name for absolute necessity, or fate, to which God and matter, or the universe, which consists of both, is immutably subject. The rational, efficient, and active principle in nature, the Stoics called by various names: nature, fate, Jupiter, God. What is nature, says Seneca, but God, the divine reason, inherent in the whole universe, and in all its parts? Or you may call him, if you please, the author of all things. And again, whatever appellations imply celestial power and energy, may be justly applied to God. His names may properly be as numerous as his offices. The term nature, when it is at all distinguished in the Stoic system from God, denotes not a separate agent, but that order of things which is necessarily produced by his perpetual agency. Since the active principle of nature is comprehended within the world, and with matter makes one whole, it necessarily follows that God penetrates, pervades, and animates matter, and the things which are formed from it; or, in other words, that he is the soul of the universe. The universe is, according to Zeno and his followers, a sentient and animated being. Nor was this a new tenet, but in some sort the doctrine of all antiquity. Pythagoras, Heraclitus, and after these, Zeno, taking it for granted that there is no real existence which is not corporeal, conceived nature to be one whole, consisting of a subtle ether and gross matter, the former the active, the latter the passive principle, as essentially united as the soul and body of man that is, they supposed God, with respect to nature, to be, not a coexisting, but an informing principle. Concerning the second principle in the universe, matter, and concerning the visible world, the doctrine of the Stoics is briefly this: matter is the first essence of all things, destitute of, but capable of receiving, qualities. Considered universally, it is an eternal whole, which neither increases nor decreases. Considered with respect to its parts, it is capable of increase or diminution, of collision and separation, and is perpetually changing. Bodies are continually tending towards dissolution. Matter always remains the same. Matter is not infinite, but finite, being circumscribed by the limits of the world, but its parts are infinitely divisible. The world is spherical in its form, and is surrounded by an infinite vacuum. The action of the divine nature upon matter first produced the element of moisture, and then the other elements, fire, air, and earth, of which all bodies are composed. Air and fire have essential levity, or tend towards the exterior surface of the world. Earth and water have essential gravity, or tend towards the center. All the elements are capable of reciprocal conversion, air passing into fire or into water, earth into air and water. But there is this essential difference among the elements, that fire and air have within themselves a principle of motion, while water and earth are merely passive. The world includes the whole of nature, God and matter, subsisted from eternity, and will forever subsist. But the present regular frame of nature had a beginning, and will have an end. The parts tend towards a dissolution, but the whole remains immutably the same. The world is liable to destruction from the prevalence of moisture or of dryness, the former producing a universal inundation, the latter a universal conflagration. These succeed each other in nature as regularly as winter and summer. When the universal inundation takes place, the whole surface of the earth is covered with water, and all animal life is destroyed. After which nature is renewed, and subsists as before, till the element of fire, becoming prevalent in its turn, dries up all the moisture, converts every substance into its own nature, and at last, by a universal conflagration, reduces the world to its pristine state. At this period, all material forms are lost in one chaotic mass. All animated nature is reunited to the Deity, and nature again exists in its original form, as one whole, consisting of God and matter. From this chaotic state, however, it again emerges by the energy of the efficient principle, and gods and men and all the forms of regulated nature are renewed, and to be dissolved and renewed in endless succession. The above is collated from Ritter, Enfield, and Levis, as a specimen of one of the earlier phases of free thought. Free thought, as then expressed, had many faults and flaws, but it has grown better every day, extending and widening its circle of utterance, and we hope that it will continue to do so. End chapter 15 of Ancient and Modern Celebrated Freethinkers. Read for you by Ted DeLorme in Fort Mill, South Carolina. If you like, you can follow me on Twitter at ThatDarnTed. Chapter 16 of Ancient and Modern Celebrated Freethinkers. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Ancient and Modern Celebrated Freethinkers by Charles Bradlaugh, Chapter 16, Matthew Tindal. It is easy to mark the progress of the age by recurring to the history of past Freethinkers. Bishops, established and dissenting, are now repeating the parts the old deist played. They were sadly treated for setting the example modern divines follow with applause. Matthew Tindal was an example of this. He labored to establish religion on the foundation of reason and nature. It was to be expected that Christians would be pleased at efforts which would have no effect but to strengthen its foundations. The effort was met by reprobation, and resented as an injury. It is but a just retaliation that believers should now have to establish in vain that evidence they once denounced. Matthew Tindal was an English deistical writer, who was born at Beer Terrace in Devonshire, 1656. His father, it appears, was a clergyman, who held the living of Beer Terrace, presented to him by the University of Cambridge in the time of the civil wars. Young Matthew was educated at Oxford, where at 28 he took the degree of LL.D., Doctor of Laws. Matthew Tindal, LL.D., was early tossed about by the winds of doctrine. First he embraced Romanism, afterwards he became a Protestant. Then politics interested him, and he engaged in controversy on the side of William III. He was appointed commissioner of a court for trying foreigners. In 1693 he published an essay on the law of nations. When 54, in 1710, he entered so vigorously into theological controversy, arising out of Trinitarian criticism, that his marked satire led to his books being condemned by the House of Commons, and burnt by the hangman. He resented this indignity by a spirited attack on the dominant priestly party in his High Church Catechism, and he also wrote in defense of philosophical necessity. But his most notable work was the performance of his old age, his Christianity as Old as the Creation, or the Gospel, a republication of the religion of nature. This was produced in his 73rd year. He was attacked in reply by Bishop Waterland. It is generally agreed that in point of good spirit and good temper, the bishop was far inferior to the deist. Dr. Conyers Middleton says Thomas Cooper, in his brief sketch of Tindal, appeared in defense of Tindal in a letter to Dr. Waterland, whom he condemned for the shallowness of his answer to Tindal, and boldly and frankly admitted that the Freethinker was right in asserting that the Jews borrowed some of their ceremonies and customs from Egypt. That allegory was in some cases employed in the Scriptures, where common readers took the relation for fact, and that the Scriptures are not of absolute and universal inspiration. The following sentence, which will be found in this letter of Dr. Conyers Middleton, does honor to his name. If religion consists in depreciating moral duties and oppressing natural reason, if the duty of it be to hate and persecute for a different way of thinking, where the best and wisest have never agreed, then I declare myself an infidel, and to have no share in that religion. Matthew Tindal died at his house in Coldbath Fields, of the Stone, 1773, aged 77. Riersbach, the famous statuary, took a model of him. Note: Julian Hibbert gives 1656-7, Dr. Beard 1656, Thomas Cooper 1657 as the year of Tindal's birth. All agree that he died 1733. He was therefore 76 or 77 at the time of his death. Tindal opens his great work thus: "The author makes no apology for writing on a subject of the last importance, and which, as far as I can find, has nowhere been so fully treated. He builds nothing on a thing so uncertain as tradition, which differs in most countries, and of which, in all countries, the bulk of mankind are incapable of judging, but thinks he has laid down such plain and evident rules as may enable men of the meanest capacity to distinguish between religion and superstition, and has represented the former in every part so beautiful, so amiable, and so strongly affecting, that they who in the least reflect must be highly in love with it, and easily perceive that their duty and happiness are inseparable. The character of the performance will be seen from a few of the propositions he maintains. That God, at all times, has given mankind sufficient means of knowing whatever he requires of them. That the religion of nature consists in observing those things which our reason, by considering the nature of God and man, and the relation we stand in to him and one another, demonstrates to be our duty, and that those things are plain, and likewise what they are. That the perfection and happiness of all rational beings, supreme as well as subordinate, consist in living up to the dictates of their nature. That God requires nothing for his own sake, no, not the worship we are to render him, nor the faith we are to have in him. That the not adhering to those notions reason dictates concerning the nature of God has been the occasion of all superstition, and those innumerable mischiefs that mankind, on the account of religion, have done either to themselves or one another. The bulk of mankind, by their reason, must be able to distinguish between religion and superstition. Otherwise they can never extricate themselves from that superstition they chance to be educated in. Tyndall deals with the question of the obscurity of revelation in these terms, sufficiently salient to alarm the very proper divines of that day. Had God from time to time spoken to all mankind in their several languages, and his words had miraculously conveyed the same ideas to all persons, yet he could not speak more plainly than he has done by the things themselves, and the relation which reason shows there is between them. Nay, since it is impossible in any book or books that a particular rule could be given for every case, we must even then have had recourse to the light of nature to teach us our duty in most cases, especially considering the numberless circumstances which attend us, and which, perpetually varying, may make the same actions, according as men are differently affected by them, either good or bad. And I may add that most of the particular rules laid down in the gospel for our direction are spoken after such figurative a manner, that except we judge of their meaning not merely by the letter, but by what the law of nature antecedently declares to be our duty, they are apt to lead us wrong. And if precepts relating to morality are delivered after an obscure manner, when they might have been delivered otherwise, what reason can you assign for its being so, but that infinite wisdom meant to refer us to that law for the explaining of them? Sufficient instances of this nature I shall give you hereafter, though I must own I cannot carry this point so far as a learned divine, who represents the Scriptures more obscure, which one would think impossible, than even the fathers. He tells us that a certain author, viz. Flaccus Illyricus, has furnished us with 51 reasons for the obscurity of the Scriptures, adding, I think I may truly say that the writing of the prophets and apostles abound with tropes and metaphors, types and allegories, parables and dark speeches, and are as much, nay, much more unintelligible in many places than the writings of the ancients. It is well this author, who talks of people being stark Bible mad, stopped here, and did not with a celebrated wit cry, the truly illuminated books are the darkest of all. The writer above mentioned suppose it impossible that God's will should be fully revealed by books, except, says he, it might be said, perhaps without a figure, that even the world itself could not contain the books which should be written. but with submission to this reverend person, I cannot help thinking, but that such is the divine goodness, God's will is so clearly and fully manifested in the book of nature, that he who runs may read it." Dean Swift, Tale of a Tub. In the next extract we make, we find Tyndall quoting two striking passages from Lord Shaftesbury, followed by an acute vindication of the integrity of the law of nature over the Scriptures. "Had the heathen distinguished themselves by creeds made out of spite to one another, and mutually persecuted each other about the worship of their gods, they would soon have made the number of their votaries as few as the gods they worshipped. But we don't find, except in Egypt, that motherland of superstition, that they ever quarreled about their gods, though their gods sometimes quarreled and fought about their votaries. By the universal liberty that was allowed by the ancients, matters, as a noble author observes, were so balanced, that reason had fair play, learning and science flourished. Wonderful was the harmony and temper which arose from these contrarieties. Thus superstition and enthusiasm were mildly treated, and being let alone, they never raged to that degree as to occasion bloodshed, wars, persecutions, and devastations. But a new sort of policy has made us leap the bounds of natural humanity, and out of a supernatural charity has taught us the way of plaguing one another most devoutly. It has raised an antipathy that no temporal interest could ever do, and entailed on us a mutual hatred to all eternity. And savage zeal with meek and pious semblance works dreadful massacre, and for heaven's sake, horrid pretense, makes desolate the earth. And further Shaftesbury observes, the Jupiter of strangers was among the ancients one of the solemn characters of divinity, the peculiar attribute of the supreme deity, benign to mankind, and recommending universal love, mutual kindness, and benignity between the remotest and most unlike of the human race. Such was the ancient heathen charity and pious duty towards the whole of mankind, both those of different nations and different worship. But, good God, how different a character do bigots give us of the Deity, making him an unjust, cruel, and inconsistent being, requiring all men to judge for themselves and act according to their consciences, and yet authorizing some among them to judge for others, and to punish them for not acting according to the consciences of those judges, though ever so much against their own. These bigots thought they were authorized to punish all those that differ with them in their religious worship, as God's enemies. But had they considered that God alone could discern men's hearts, and alone discover whether any, by conscientiously offering him a wrong worship, could become his enemies, and that infinite wisdom best knew how to proportion the punishment to the fault, as well as infinite power how to inflict it, they would surely have left it to God to judge for himself, in a cause which immediately related to himself, and where they were not so much as parties concerned, and as likely to be mistaken as those they would punish. Can one, without horror, think of men's breaking through all the rules of doing as they would be done unto, in order to set themselves up for standards of truth for God as well as man? Do not these impious wretches suppose that God is not able to judge for himself? At least, not able to execute his own judgment? And that therefore he has recourse, forsooth, to their superior knowledge or power, and they are to revenge his injuries, root out his enemies, and restore his lost honor, though with the destruction of the better part of mankind? But to do the propagators of these blasphemous notions justice, they do not throw this load of scandal on the law of nature, or so much as pretend from thence to authorize their execrable principles, but endeavor to support them by traditional religion, especially by misinterpreted texts from the Old Testament, and thereby make not only natural and revealed religion, but the Old and New Testament, the latter of which requires doing good both to Jews and Gentiles, contradict each other. But to return, if what the light of nature teaches us concerning the divine perfections, when duly attended to, is not only sufficient to hinder us from falling into superstition of any kind whatever, but, as I have already shown, demonstrates what God from his infinite wisdom and goodness can or cannot command. How is it possible that the law of nature and grace can differ? How can it be conceived that God's laws, whether internally or externally revealed, are not at all times the same, when the author of them is, and has been immutably the same forever? The following passage exhibits the judicious mixture of authority and argument for which our author is remarkable. The quotation is a good illustration of Tyndall's best manner. He is replying to Dr. Samuel Clarke. It cannot be imputed to any defect in the light of nature that the pagan world ran into idolatry, but to their being entirely governed by priests who pretended communication with their gods, and to have thence their revelations, which they imposed on the credulous as divine oracles. Whereas the business of the Christian dispensation was to destroy all those traditional revelations, and restore, free from all idolatry, the true, primitive, and natural religion implanted in mankind from the creation. The Dr. Clarke, however, seems afraid lest he had allowed too much to the light of nature, in relation to the discovery of our duty both to God and man, and not left room for revelation to make any addition. He therefore supposes there are some duties which nature hints at only in general. But if we cannot, without highly reflecting on the wisdom and goodness of God, suppose that he has not, at all times, given the whole rational creation a plain rule for their conduct, in relation to those duties they owe to God, themselves, and one another, must we not suppose reason and religion that rule of all other rules inseparable, so that no rational creature can be ignorant of it, who attends to the dictates of his own mind? I mean, as far as it is necessary for him to know it. An ignorant peasant may know what is sufficient for him, without knowing as much as the learned rector of St. James's. Though the Doctor says the knowledge of the law of nature is in fact by no means universal, yet he asserts that man is plainly in his own nature an accountable creature, which supposes that the light of nature plainly and undeniably teaches him that law, for breach of which he is naturally accountable. And did not the Doctor believe this law to be universal, he could not infer a future judgment from the conscience all men have of their actions, or the judgment they pass on them in their own minds, whereby they that have not any law are a law unto themselves, their consciences bearing witness, and their thoughts accusing or excusing one another, which is supposing but one law, whether that law be written on paper or in men's hearts only, and that all men by the judgment they pass on their own actions are conscious of this law. And the Apostle Paul, though quoted by the Doctor, is so far from favoring his hypothesis of any invincible ignorance, even in the wisest and best of the philosophers, that he, by saying the Gentiles that have not the law do by nature the things contained in the law, makes the law of nature and grace to be the same, and supposes the reason why they were to be punished was their sinning against light and knowledge. that which may be known of God was manifest in them, and when they knew God, they glorified him not as God. And they were likewise guilty of abominable corruptions, not ignorantly, but knowing the judgment of God, that they who do such things are worthy of death. Had the doctor but considered this self-evident proposition, that there can be no transgression where there is no law, and that an unknown law is the same as no law, and consequently that all mankind, at all times, must be capable of knowing all, whether more or less, that God requires, it would have prevented his endeavoring to prove that, till the gospel dispensation, mankind were entirely and unavoidably ignorant of their duty in several important points, and thus charging the light of nature with undeniable defects. I think it no compliment to external revelation, though the doctor designed it as the highest, to say it prevailed when the light of nature was, as he supposes, in a manner extinct, since then an irrational religion might as easily obtain as a rational one. The doctor, to prove that revelation has supplied the insufficiency and undeniable defects of the light of nature, refers us to Philippians 4:1, which he introduces after this pompous manner: "Let any man of an honest and sincere mind consider whether that practical doctrine has not, even in itself, the greatest marks of a divine original, wherein whatsoever things are true, whatsoever things are honest, whatsoever things are just, whatsoever things are pure, whatsoever things are lovely, whatsoever things are of good report, if there be any virtue, if there be anything praiseworthy, all these, and these only, are earnestly recommended to man's practice." I would ask the doctor how he can know what these are, which are thus alone earnestly recommended to man's practice, or why they have in themselves the greatest marks of a divine original, but from the light of nature. Nay, how can the doctor know there are defects in the light of nature, but from that light itself, which supposes this light is all we have to trust to, and consequently all the doctor has been doing, on pretense of promoting the honor of revelation, is introducing universal skepticism, and I am concerned and grieved to see a man who had so great a share of the light of nature, employing it to expose that light, of which before he had given the highest commendation, and which can have no other effect than to weaken even his own demonstration, drawn from that light for the being of a God. I shall mention but one text more, which, had not the doctor thought it highly to his purpose for showing the insufficiency of the light of nature, he would not have ushered it in after this most solemn manner: "When men have put themselves into this temper and frame of mind, let them try if they can any longer reject the evidence of the gospel. If any man will do his will, he shall know of the doctrine, whether it be of God." Is it not strange to see so judicious a divine write after such a manner, as if he thought the best way to support the dignity of revelation was to derogate from the immutable and eternal law of nature, and while he is depressing it, extol revelation for those very things it borrows from that law, in which, though he asserts there are undeniable defects, yet he owns that God governs all his own actions by it, and expects that all men should so govern theirs. But I find the doctor's own brother, the Dean of Sarum, is entirely of my mind as to those texts the doctor quotes, viz. Romans 2:14 and Philippians 4:8. As to the first, viz. Romans 2:14, he says, "The apostle supposes that the moral law is founded in the nature and reason of things; that every man is endued with such powers and faculties of mind as render him capable of seeing and taking notice of this law, and also with such a sense and judgment of the reasonableness and fitness of conforming his actions to it, that he cannot but in his own mind acquit himself when he does so, and condemn himself when he does otherwise. And as to the second, viz. Philippians 4:8, where the same apostle recommends the practice of virtue upon the forementioned principles of comeliness and reputation. These principles, says he, if duly attended to, were sufficient to instruct men in the whole of their duty towards themselves and towards each other, and they would also have taught them their duty towards God, their Creator and Governor, if they had diligently pursued them. For according as the apostle expresses it, Romans 1:20, the invisible things of God from the creation of the world are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made, even his eternal power and Godhead. The same fitness and decency that appears in men's regular behavior towards each other, appears also in their behavior towards God. And this likewise is founded in the nature and reason of things, and is what the circumstances and condition they are in do absolutely require. Thus we see therein moral virtue, or good, consists, and what the obligation to it is from its own native beauty and excellency. One more example of Tyndall's style will show how skillfully and cogently he forced the great authorities of his day to bear witness to the truth of his leading proposition, the natural antiquity of all the reasonable precepts of the Bible. The most accurate Dr. Barrow gives this character of the Christian religion, that its precepts are no other than such as physicians prescribe for the health of our bodies, as politicians would allow to be needful for the peace of the state, as Epicurean philosophers recommend for the tranquillity of our minds and pleasures of our lives, such as reason dictates and daily shows conducive to our welfare in all respects, which consequently, were there no law enacting them, we should in wisdom choose to observe and voluntarily impose them on ourselves, confessing them to be fit matters of law, and most advantageous and requisite to the good, general and particular, of mankind. That great and good man, Dr. Tillotson, says that all the precepts of Christianity are reasonable and wise, requiring such duties as are suitable to the light of nature, and do approve themselves to the best reason of mankind, such as have their foundation in the nature of God, and are an imitation of the divine excellencies, such as tend to the perfection of human nature, and to raise the minds of men to the highest pitch of goodness and virtue. They command nothing that is unnecessary, they omit nothing that may tend to the glory of God, or the welfare of men, nor do they restrain us in anything, but what is contrary to the regular inclinations of nature, or to our reason and true interest. They forbid us nothing but what is base and unworthy to serve our humors and passions, to make ourselves fools and beasts. In a word, nothing but what tends to our private harm or prejudice, or to public disorder and confusion. The late Dean of Canterbury, in a sermon preached in defense of Christianity, says, "What can be a more powerful incentive to obedience than for a rational creature clearly to discern the equity, the necessity, the benefit, the decency and beauty of every action he is called to do, and thence to be duly sensible how gracious a master he serves? One that is so far from loading him with fruitless, arbitrary, and tyrannical impositions, that each command abstracted from his command who issues it, is able to recommend itself, and nothing required but what every wise man would choose of his own accord, and cannot, without being his own enemy, wish to be exempted from." and this character of Christianity he makes to be essential to its being from God, and therefore must make it the same with natural religion, which has this character impressed on it. There was none of the doctrines of our Savior, says the late Archbishop of York, calculated for the gratification of men's idle curiosities, the busying and amusing them with airy and useless speculations; much less were they intended for an exercise of our credulity, or a trial how far we could bring our reason to submit to our faith. But as on the one hand they were plain and simple, and such as by their agreeableness to the rational faculties of mankind did highly recommend themselves to our belief, and so on the other hand they had an immediate relation to practice, and were the general principles and foundation on which all human and divine virtues were naturally to be superstructed. Sermon before the Queen on Christmas Day, 1724. Does not every one see that if the religion of nature had been put instead of Christianity, these descriptions would have exactly agreed with it? The judicious Dr. Scott affirms, God never imposes laws on us pro imperio, as arbitrary tests and trials of our obedience. The great design of them, says he, is to do us good, and direct our actions to our own interest. This, if we firmly believe, will infinitely encourage our obedience; for when I am sure God commands me nothing but what my own health, ease, and happiness requires, and that every law of his is both a necessary and sovereign prescription against the diseases of my nature, he could not prescribe less than he has, without being defective in his care of my recovery and happiness. With what prudence and modesty can I grudge to obey him? Nay, the most considerate men, even among the papists, do not scruple to maintain there's nothing in religion but what is moral. The divines of Port Royal, for instance, say, all the precepts and all the mysteries that are expressed in so many different ways in the holy volumes, do all centre in this one commandment, of loving God with all our heart, and in loving our neighbors as ourselves. For the Scripture, it is St. Austin who says it, forbids but one only thing, which is concupiscence, or the love of the creature, as it commands but one only thing, which is charity and the love of God. Upon this double precept is founded the whole system of the Christian religion, and it is unto this, say they, according to the expression of Jesus Christ, that all the ancient law and the prophets have reference, and we may add also all the mysteries and all the precepts of the new law. For love, says St. Paul, is the fulfilling of the law. And these divines likewise cite a remarkable passage of St. Austin on this subject, viz., he that knows how to love God and to regulate his life by that love, knows all that the Scripture propounds to be known; and might add the authority of a greater man, and a papist too, who says, religion adds nothing to natural probity, but the consolation of doing that for love and obedience to our Heavenly Father, which reason itself requires us do in favor of virtue. Archbishop of Cambray, Letters sur la Religion, page 258, Paris. Tyndall was a solid rather than a brilliant writer, but he perfectly knew what he was about, and the work from which we quote was well conceived and carefully executed. His ground was skillfully chosen, his arguments were placed on an eminence where his friends could see them, and where his enemies could not assail them. Dr. Leland, in his view of deistical writers, is quite in a rage with him, because he discredits book revelation to set up nature's revelation. His real offense was, that he did prove that nature was the only source of truth and reason, the criterion by which even divine revelation must be judged. He carried men back to the gospel of nature, by the side of which the gospel of the Jewish fishermen did not show to advantage. Tyndall did put something in the place of that which he was supposed desirous of removing. How unwilling Christians of that day were to admit of improvement in religion, is shown by the number of attacks Tyndall's works sustained. The Bishop of London published a second pastoral letter against it. Dr. Thomas Burnet confuted it. Mr. Law fully answered it. Dr. Stebbing obviated the principal objections in it. The same learned and judicious writer, observes Leland, a second time entered the lists in answer to the 14th chapter of a book entitled Christianity as Old as the Creation. Mr. Balgny issued a second letter to a deist, occasioned by Tyndall's work. Mr. Anthony O'Key gave a short view of the whole controversy. Dr. Forater, Dr. John Conybeare particularly engaged public attention as Dr. Tyndall's antagonists. Mr. Simon Brown produced a solid and excellent answer, and Dr. Leland, with many blushes, tells us that he himself issued in Dublin, in 1773, 2 volumes, taking a wider compass than the other answers. Christianity as Old as the Creation is a work which Freethinkers may yet consult with advantage, as a repertory of authorities no longer accessible to the readers of this generation. What these authorities allege will be found to have intrinsic value, to be indeed lasting testimonies in favor of rationalism. In passing in review the noble truths, Tyndall insists that it is impossible not to wonder at the policy, or rather want of policy, displayed by Christians. Tyndall is an author whom they might be proud of, if they were really in love with reason. Tyndall's opponents have shown how instinctively the children of faith distrust the truths of nature. After all the refutations and confutations and answers made to the great deist, Tyndall's work has maintained its ground, and the truths he so ably and spiritedly vindicated have spread wider since, and taken deeper root. End chapter 16 of Ancient and Modern Celebrated Freethinkers by Charles Bradlaugh. Read for you by Ted DeLorme in Fort Mill, South Carolina. Origin of Moral. Chapter 17 of Ancient and Modern Celebrated Freethinkers. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Ancient and Modern Celebrated Freethinkers by Charles Bradlaugh. Chapter 17. David Hume. Lord Brougham has rendered service not only to letters, but also to Freethought by his admirable Lives, incomparably the best we have, of Voltaire, Rousseau, Hume, Gibbon, etc. From Lord Brougham we learn, whose life in this sketch we follow, that David Hume, related to the Earl of Hume's family, was born in Edinburgh in April, 1711. Refusing to be made a lawyer, he was sent, in 1734, to a mercantile house in Bristol. The desk not suiting the embryo historian's genius, we find him in 1737 at La Flèche, in Anjou, writing his stillborn Treatise on Human Nature, which in 1742, in separate essays, attracted some notice. Keeper and companion to the Marquis of Annandale in 1745, private secretary to General St. Clair in 1747, he visited on embassy the courts of Vienna and Turin. While at Turin he completed his Inquiry Concerning the Human Understanding, the Treatise on Human Nature, in a new form. Returned to Scotland, he published his Political Discourses in 1752, and the same year his Inquiry Concerning the Principles of Morals. The Essays, Moral and Metaphysical, are the form in which we now read these speculations. In 1752, Hume became librarian to the Faculty of Advocates. In 1754, he published the first volume of his History of England. In 1755 appeared his Natural History of Religion. In 1736 he accompanied the British ambassador to Paris. In 1765 he became Charge d'Affaires. In 1766 he was appointed Under Secretary of State under Marshal Conway. In 1775 he was seized with a mortal disease, which he bore without any abatement of his cheerfulness, and on the 25th of August, Le Bon David, as he was styled in Paris, died, to use his own words, having no enemies, except all the Whigs, all the Tories, and all the Christians, which was something to his honor, and a testimony of the usefulness of his life. David Hume was the first writer who gave historical distinction to Great Britain. Lord John Russell remarked in a speech at Bristol in October, 1854, "We have no other history of England than Hume's. When a young man of 18 asks for a history of England, there is no resource but to give him Hume." Hume was the author of the modern doctrines of politics and political economy, which now rule the world of science. He was the sagacious unfolder of truth, the accurate and bold discoverer of popular error. More than a skeptic, he was an atheist. Such is Lord Brougham's judgment of him. Hume carried free thought into high places. In originality of thought, grace of style, and logical ability, he distanced all rival writers on religion in his time, and what is of no small importance, his life was as blameless as his intellect was unapproachable. Our first extract from his writings is a felicitous statement of the pro and con on the questions of polygamous and single marriages. "A man, in conjoining himself to a woman, is bound to her according to the terms of his engagement. In begetting children, he is bound by all the ties of nature and humanity to provide for their subsistence and education. When he has performed these two parts of duty, no one can reproach him with injustice or injury. And as the terms of his engagement, as well as the methods of subsisting his offspring, may be various, it is mere superstition to imagine that marriage can be entirely uniform, and will admit only of one mode or form. Did not human laws restrain the natural liberty of men, every particular marriage would be as difficult as contracts or bargains of any other kind or species. As circumstances vary, and the laws propose different advantages, we find that, in different times and places, they impose different conditions on this important contract. In Tonkin, it is usual for the sailors, when the ship comes into the harbor, to marry for the season, and, notwithstanding this precarious engagement, they are assured, it is said, of the strictest fidelity to their bed, as well as in the whole management of their affairs, from those temporary spouses. I cannot at present recollect my authorities, but I have somewhere read that the Republic of Athens, having lost many of its citizens by war and pestilence, allowed every man to marry 2 wives, in order the sooner to repair the waste which had been made by these calamities. The poet Euripides happened to be coupled to 2 noisy vixens, who so plagued him with their jealousies and quarrels, that he became ever after a professed woman-hater, and is the only theatrical writer, perhaps the only poet, that ever entertained an aversion to the sex. The advocates for polygamy may recommend it as the only effectual remedy for the disorders of love, and the only expedient for freeing men from that slavery to the females which the natural violence of our passions has imposed upon us. By this means alone can we regain our right of sovereignty, and, sating our appetite, re-establish the authority of reason in our minds, and, of consequence, our own authority in our families. Man, like a weak sovereign, being unable to support himself against the wiles and intrigues of his subjects, must play one faction against another, and become absolute by the mutual jealousy of the females. To divide and to govern is an universal maxim, and by neglecting it the Europeans undergo a more grievous and more ignominious slavery than the Turks or Persians, who are subjected indeed to a sovereign that lies at a distance from them, but in their domestic affairs rules with an uncontrollable sway. On the other hand, it may be urged with better reason that this sovereignty of the male is a real usurpation, and destroys that nearness of rank, not to say equality, which nature has established between the sexes. We are, by nature, their lovers, their friends, their patrons. Would we willingly exchange such endearing appellations for the barbarous title of master and tyrant? In what capacity shall we gain by this inhuman proceeding? As lovers or as husbands? The lover is totally annihilated, and courtship, the most agreeable scene in life, can no longer have place where women have not the free disposal of themselves, but are bought and sold like the meanest animal. The husband is as little a gainer, having found the admirable secret of extinguishing every part of love except its jealousy. No rose without its thorn, but he must be a foolish wretch indeed that throws away the rose, and preserves only the thorn. But the Asiatic matters are as destructive to friendship as to love. Jealousy excludes men from all intimacies and familiarities with each other. No one dares bring his friend to his house or table, lest he bring a lover to his numerous wives. Hence, all over the East, each family is as much separate from another as if there were so many distinct kingdoms. No wonder, then, that Solomon, living like an Eastern prince, with his 700 wives and 300 concubines, without one friend, could write so pathetically concerning the vanity of the world. Had he tried the secret of one wife or mistress, a few friends, and a great many companions, he might have found life somewhat more agreeable. Destroy love and friendship, what remains in the world worth accepting? Next we quote his famous statement of the principle of utility in morals. There has been a controversy started of late much better worth examination, concerning the general foundation of morals, whether they be derived from reason or from sentiment; whether we attain the knowledge of them by a chain of argument and induction, or by an immediate feeling and finer internal sense; whether, like all sound judgment of truth and falsehood, they should be the name to every rational intelligent being, or whether, like the perception of beauty and deformity, they be founded entirely on the particular fabric and constitution of the human species. The ancient philosophers, though they often affirm that virtue is nothing but conformity to reason, yet, in general, seem to consider morals as deriving their existence from taste and sentiment. On the other hand, our modern inquirers, though they also talk much of the beauty of virtue and deformity of vice, yet have commonly endeavored to account for these distinctions by metaphysical reasonings, and by deductions from the most abstract principles of the understanding. Such confusion reigned in these subjects, that an opposition of the greatest consequence could prevail between one system and another, and even in the parts of almost each individual system, and yet nobody, till very lately, was ever sensible of it. The elegant Lord Shaftesbury, who first gave occasion to remark this distinction, and who in general adhered to the principles of the ancients, is not himself entirely free from the same confusion. In all determinations of morality, the circumstance of public utility is ever principally in view; and wherever disputes arise, either in philosophy or common life, concerning the bounds of duty, the question cannot by any means be decided with greater certainty than by ascertaining, on any side, the true interests of mankind. If any false opinion, embraced from appearances, has been found to prevail, as soon as farther experience and sounder reasoning have given us juster notions of human affairs, we retract our first sentiment, and adjust anew the boundaries of moral good and evil. Giving alms to common beggars is naturally praised, because it seems to carry relief to the distressed and indigent. But when we observe the encouragement thence arising to idleness and debauchery, we regard that species of charity rather as a weakness than a virtue. Tyrannicide, or the assassination of usurpers and oppressive princes, was highly extolled in ancient times, because it both freed mankind from many of these monsters, and seemed to keep the others in awe whom the sword or poniard could not reach. But history and experience have since convinced us that this practice increases the jealousy and cruelty of princes. A Timoleon or a Brutus, though treated with indulgence on account of the prejudices of their times, are now considered as very improper models for imitation. Liberality in princes is regarded as a mark of beneficence; but when it occurs that the homely bread of the honest and industrious is often thereby converted into delicious cakes for the idle and the prodigal, we soon retract our heedless praises. The regrets of a prince for having lost a day were noble and generous; but had he intended to have spent it in acts of generosity to his greedy courtiers, it was better lost than misemployed after that manner. That justice is useful to society, and consequently that part of its merit, at least, must arise from that consideration, it would be a superfluous undertaking to prove. That public utility is the sole origin of justice; that reflections on the beneficial consequences of this virtue are the sole foundation of its merits. This proposition, being more curious and important, will better deserve our examination and inquiry. Let us suppose that nature has bestowed on the human race such profuse abundance of all external conveniences, that, without any uncertainty in the event, without any care or industry on our part, every individual finds himself fully provided with whatever his most voracious appetite can want, or luxurious imagination wish or desire. His natural beauty, we shall suppose, surpasses all acquired ornaments. The perpetual clemency of the seasons renders useless all clothes or covering. The raw herbage affords him the most delicious fare. The clear fountain, the richest beverage. No laborious occupation required, no tillage, no navigation. Music, poetry, and contemplation form his sole business. Conversation, mirth, and friendship his sole amusement. It seems evident that in such a happy state every other social virtue would flourish and receive tenfold increase. But the cautious, jealous virtue of justice would never once have been dreamed of. For what purpose make a partition of goods, where every one has already more than enough? Why give rise to property, where there cannot possibly be any injury? Why call this object mine, when upon seizing of it by another, I need but stretch out my hand to possess myself of what is equally valuable? Justice in that case, being totally useless, would be an idle ceremonial, and could never possibly have place in the catalogue of virtues. we see, even in the present necessitous condition of mankind, that wherever any benefit is bestowed by nature in an unlimited abundance, we leave it always in common among the whole human race, and make no subdivisions of right and property. Water and air, though the most necessary of all objects, are not challenged as the property of individuals, nor can any man commit injustice by the most lavish use and enjoyment of these blessings. In fertile, extensive countries, with few inhabitants, land is regarded on the same footing, and no topic is so much insisted on by those who defend the liberty of the seas as the unexhausted use of them in navigation. Were the advantages procured by navigation as inexhaustible, these reasoners had never had any adversaries to refute, nor had any claims ever been advanced of a separate, exclusive dominion over the ocean. Suppose a society to fall into such want of all common necessaries, that the utmost frugality and industry cannot preserve the greater number from perishing, and the whole from extreme misery. It will readily, I believe, be admitted that the strict laws of justice are suspended in such a pressing emergence, and give place to the stronger motives of necessity and self-preservation. Is it any crime, after a shipwreck, to seize whatever means or instrument of safety one can lay hold of, without regard to former limitations of property? Or, if a city besieged were perishing with hunger, can we imagine that men will see any means of preservation before them, and lose their lives from a scrupulous regard to what, in other situations, would be the rules of equality and justice? The use and tendency of that virtue is to procure happiness and security by preserving order in society. But where the society is ready to perish from extreme necessity, no greater evil can be dreaded from violence and injustice, and every man may now provide for himself by all the means which prudence can dictate or humanity permit. The public, even in less urgent necessities, opens granaries without the consent of proprietors, as justly supposing that the authority of magistracy may, consistent with equality, extend so far. But were any number of men to assemble without the tie of laws or civil jurisdiction, would an equal partition of bread in a famine, though effected by power and even violence, be regarded as criminal or injurious? Suppose, likewise, that it should be a virtuous man's fate to fall into the society of ruffians, remote from the protection of laws and government, what conduct must he embrace in that melancholy situation? He sees such a desperate rapaciousness prevail, such a disregard to equity, such contempt of order, such stupid blindness to future consequences, as must immediately have the most tragical conclusion, and must terminate in destruction to the greater number, and in a total dissolution of society to the rest. He, meanwhile, can have no other expedient than to arm himself, to whomever the sword he seizes, or the buckler may belong, to make provision of all means of defense and security, and his particular regard to justice being no longer of use to his own safety or that of others, he must consult the dictates of self-preservation alone, without concern for those who no longer merit his care and attention. But perhaps the difficulty of accounting for these effects of usefulness, or its contrary, has kept philosophers from admitting them into their systems of ethics, and has induced them to employ any other principle in explaining the origin of moral good and evil. But it is no just reason for rejecting any principle, confirmed by experience, that we cannot give a satisfactory account of its origin, nor are we able to resolve it into other more general principles. And if we would employ a little thought on the present subject, we need be at no loss to account for the influence of utility, and deduce it from principles the most known and avowed in human nature. Usefulness is agreeable, and engages our approbation. This is a matter of fact, confirmed by daily observation. But useful for what? For somebody's interest, surely. Whose interest, then? Not our own only, for our approbation frequently extends farther. It must therefore be the interest of those who are served by the character or action approved of; and these we may conclude, however remote, are not totally indifferent to us. By opening up this principle, we shall discover one great source of moral distinctions. The origin and mischiefs of theistic influences is the subject of the following passage. It must necessarily indeed be allowed, that in order to carry men's attention beyond the present course of things, or lead them into any inference concerning invisible intelligent power, they must be actuated by some passion which prompts their thought and reflection, some motive which urges their first inquiry. But what passion shall we here have recourse to, for explaining an effect of such mighty consequence? Not speculative curiosity, surely, or the pure love of truth. That motive is too refined for such gross apprehensions, and would lead men into inquiries concerning the frame of nature, a subject too large and comprehensive for their narrow capacities. No passions, therefore, can be supposed to work upon such barbarians, but the ordinary affections of human life, the anxious concern for happiness, the dread of future misery, the terror of death, the thirst of revenge, the appetite for food and other necessities. Agitated by hopes and fears of this nature, especially the latter, men scrutinize with a trembling curiosity the course of future causes, and examine the various and contrary events of human life. And in this disordered scene, with eyes still more disordered and astonished, they see the first obscure traces of divinity. We hang in perpetual suspense between life and death, health and sickness, plenty and want, which are distributed amongst the human species by secret and unknown causes, whose operation is oft unexpected and always unaccountable. These unknown causes, then, become the constant object of hope and fear; and while the passions are kept in perpetual alarm by an anxious expectation of the events, the imagination is equally employed in forming ideas of those powers on which we have so entire a dependence. Could men anatomize nature according to the most probable, at least the most intelligible philosophy, they would find that these causes are nothing but the particular fabric and structure of the minute parts of their own bodies and of external objects, and that by a regular and constant machinery all the events are produced, about which they are so much concerned. There is an universal tendency among mankind to conceive all beings like themselves, and to transfer to every object those qualities with which they are familiarly acquainted, and of which they are intimately conscious. We find human faces in the moon, armies in the clouds, and by a natural propensity, if not corrected by experience and reflection, ascribe malice or goodwill to everything that hurts or pleases us. Hence the frequency and beauty of the prosopopoia in poetry, whereof nature acquires sentiment, where trees, mountains, and streams are personified, and the inanimate parts of nature acquire sentiment and passion. And though these poetical figures and expressions gain not on the belief, they may serve at least to prove a certain tendency in the imagination, without which they could neither be beautiful nor natural. Nor is a river god or hamadryad always taken for a mere poetical or imaginary personage, but may sometimes enter into the real creed of the ignorant vulgar, while each grove or field is represented as possessed of a particular genius or invisible power, which inhabits and protects it. Nay, philosophers cannot entirely exempt themselves from this natural frailty, but have oft ascribed to inanimate matter the horror of a vacuum, sympathies, antipathies, and other affections of human nature. The absurdity is not less, while we cast our eyes upwards, and transferring, as is too usual, human passions and infirmities to the Deity, represent him as jealous and revengeful, capricious and partial, and, in short, a wicked and foolish man in every respect but his superior power and authority. No wonder, then, that mankind, being placed in such an absolute ignorance of causes, and being at the same time so anxious concerning their future fortune, should immediately acknowledge a dependence on invisible powers, possessed of sentiment and intelligence. The unknown causes which continually employ their thought, appearing always in the same aspect, are all apprehended to be of the same kind or species. Nor is it long before we ascribe to them thought, and reason, and passion, and sometimes even the limbs and figures of men, in order to bring them nearer to a resemblance with ourselves. It is remarkable that the principles of religion have a kind of flux and reflux in the human mind, and that men have a natural tendency to rise from idolatry to theism, and to sink again from theism into idolatry. The vulgar, that is indeed all mankind, a few excepted, being ignorant and uninstructed, never elevate their contemplation to the heavens, or penetrate by their disquisitions into the secret structure of vegetable or animal bodies, so far as to discover a supreme mind, or original providence, which bestowed order on every part of nature. They consider these admirable works in a more confined and selfish view, and finding their own happiness and misery to depend on the secret influence and unforeseen concurrence of external objects, they regard with perpetual attention the unknown causes which govern all these natural events, and distribute pleasure and pain, good and ill, by their powerful but silent operation. The unknown causes are still appealed to on every emergency, and in this general appearance or confused image are the perpetual objects of human hopes and fears, wishes and apprehensions. By degrees, the active imagination of men, uneasy in this abstract conception of objects about which it is incessantly employed, begins to render them more particular, and to clothe them in shapes more suitable to its natural comprehension. It represents them to be sensible, intelligent beings, like mankind, actuated by love and hatred, and flexible by gifts and entreaties, by prayers and sacrifices. Hence the origin of religion, and hence the origin of idolatry or polytheism. More has been written by theologians in endeavors to refute the following passage than has ever been called forth by the wit of man before by the same number of words. A miracle is a violation of the laws of nature, and as a firm and unalterable experience has established these laws, the proof against a miracle, from the very nature of the fact, is as entire as any argument from experience can possibly be imagined. Why is it more than probable that all men must die? That lead cannot of itself remain suspended in the air? That fire consumes wood, and is extinguished by water? Unless it be that these events are found agreeable to the laws of nature, and there is required a violation of these laws, or, in other words, a miracle to prevent them. Nothing is esteemed a miracle if it ever happen in the common course of nature. It is no miracle that a man seemingly in good health should die on a sudden, because such a kind of death, though more unusual than any other, has yet been frequently observed to happen. But it is a miracle that a dead man should come to life, because that has never been observed in any age or country. There must, therefore, be a uniform experience against every miraculous event. Otherwise the event would not merit that appellation; and as a uniform experience amounts to a proof, there is here a direct and full proof, from the nature of the fact, against the existence of any miracle; nor can such a proof be destroyed, or the miracle rendered credible, but by an opposite proof which is superior. The plain consequence is, and it is a general maxim worthy of our attention, that no testimony is sufficient to establish a miracle, unless the testimony be of such a kind that its falsehood would be more miraculous than the fact which it endeavors to establish; and even in that case there is a mutual destruction of arguments, and the superior only gives us an assurance suitable to that degree of force which remains after deducting the inferior. When any one tells me that he saw a dead man restored to life, I immediately consider with myself whether it be more probable that this person should either deceive or be deceived, or that the fact which he relates should really have happened. I weigh the one miracle against the other, and according to the superiority which I discover, I pronounce my decision, and always reject the greater miracle. If the falsehood of his testimony would be more miraculous than the event which he relates, then, and not till then, can he pretend to command my belief or opinion. There is not to be found in all history any miracle attested by a sufficient number of men, of such unquestioned good sense, education, and learning, as to secure us against all delusion in themselves; of such undoubted integrity, as to place them beyond all suspicion of any design to deceive others; of such credit and reputation in the eyes of mankind, as to have a great deal to lose in case of their being detected in any falsehood; and at the same time attesting facts performed in such a public manner, and in so celebrated a part of the world, as to render the detection unavoidable. All which circumstances are requisite to give us a full assurance of the testimony of men. One of the best attested miracles in all profane history is that which Tacitus reports of Vespasian, who cured a blind man in Alexandria by means of his spittle, and a lame man by the mere touch of his foot, in obedience to a vision of the god Seriphus, who had enjoined them to have recourse to the emperor or for these miraculous cures. The story may be seen in that fine historian, where every circumstance seems to add weight to the testimony, and might be displayed at large with all the force of argument and eloquence, if any one were now concerned to enforce the evidence of that exploded and idolatrous superstition. The gravity, solidity, age, and probity of so great an emperor, who, through the whole course of his life, conversed in a familiar manner with his friends and courtiers, and never affected those extraordinary airs of divinity assumed by Alexander and Demetrius. The historian, a contemporary writer, noted for candor and veracity, and withal the greatest and most penetrating genius, perhaps of all antiquity, and so free from any tendency to credulity, that he even lies under the contrary imputation of atheism and profaneness. The persons from whose authority he related the miracle of established character for judgment and veracity, as we may well presume, eye witnesses of the fact, and confirming their testimony, after the Flavian family was despoiled of the empire, and could no longer give any reward as the price of a lie. Utrumque qui interfuere nunc quoque memorant, postquam nullum mendatio precium. to which, if we add the public nature of the facts as related, it will appear that no evidence can well be supposed stronger for so gross and so palpable a falsehood. These extracts will give some idea of the grace and power and penetration of Hume. The society he kept, the abilities with which he was justly credited, the reputation his works deservedly won for him, made him a man of mark and influence in his day. Read by the learned, courted by statesmen, he taught gentlemen liberality, and governments toleration. The influence of Hume, silent and inappreciable to the multitude, has been of the utmost importance to the nation. His works have been studied by philosophers, politicians, and prelates. The writings of no Freethinker except Voltaire have maintained their ground with continually increasing reputation. Oddly enough, none of Hume's works were popular when they first appeared. In fact, his treatise on human nature, which he had to reprint in the form of essays 5 years after its first publication, it then, for the first time, began to be bought, but not to any great extent. 5 years later, he again made it reappear under the form of an Inquiry Concerning the Human Understanding. It was not until this third publication that he began to perceive symptoms of its coming into notice. The world has since made up for its negligence, by perpetual comment and solid appreciation. A king among thinkers, the clergy have, in the provinces of politics and philosophical speculation, to acknowledge allegiance to him, however they may rebel against his theological heresies. End section 17 of Ancient and Modern Celebrated Freethinkers. Read for you by Ted DeLorme in Fort Mill, South Carolina.